Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be hearing about Stonehenge and other stone circles. Our guest is John Steele, an archaeologist who coordinates the Dragon Project in London, England. John Steele has a background in mathematics, geology, and anthropology, and taught at the University of London for several years. What is a stone circle?
Stone circle is exactly what it says. It's a configuration of stones in a circular form, traditionally in the European landscape. For example, in England there are some 900 of them. Stone circles have a function of an astronomical nature. That is to say, they temporally orient you in the landscape by the sun and the moon, how they appear in the landscape. They also predict eclipses. They're also thought to be the first form of temples. That is to say, they were areas of where fertility in the landscape was concentrated in ritual, and they have a very interesting kind of effect on the entire landscape through the rituals which were performed there.
How can they be all those things when most of them were constructed at a time when there were not powerful telescopes, there were obviously no satellites, you couldn't get an aerial view, you couldn't do the type of sophisticated surveying that we've done today, and yet they are found at precise locations to be able to predict an eclipse?
Okay, that's a really good question because it brings up the point that many people in the past had considered the people who built stone circles to be kind of primitive barbarians, kind of the druidic types who sacrifice virgins on full moons, that type of thing. It's very interesting that a Professor Alexander Thom of Oxford University spent 40 years of his time surveying these circles and found some very interesting facts which he presented to the Royal Society of England in 1972. To sum them up, he found that there is a standard unit of length incorporated in every one of these stone circles, in their circumference and diameter, which he called the megalithic yard. It is exactly 2.72 feet, plus or minus 0.003 inches. In other words, it's to engineering accuracy that these things are built. It completely destroyed the conception that these things were random. Furthermore, before Pythagoras, the Pythagorean theorem is in the geometry of these things. Their geometry is highly sophisticated. For example, there are constructions where they deliberately flattened the tops of circles so that they were not perfectly circular. And Professor Thom, when asked why, he said he thought that they didn't like that pi, the ratio of the circumference to diameter, should be 3.14159 ... It never came out even. They tried to make pi come out exactly 3.0. So these people were highly sophisticated. The other aspect, you said they didn't have telescopes. How did they make these observations? Well, first of all, you have to consider this is way before television or any other type of external entertainment. So for thousands of years, they literally sat around the campfires, no electric lights, no distortion of the atmosphere, and every single night they would notice where the moon went down over the horizon, and they noticed that it would go down a little different every single night over the hillside. They noticed, for example, that it would take 18.61 years to go from its most northerly extreme point on the horizon to its most southerly. And they encoded this into the stone circles in the relationships of the stones. It was simply by direct daily observation over an immense amount of time that these calculations were recorded and encoded.
So far, we've talked about thousands of years in terms of a period, and you've also used the word they.
Right.
Who were they?
Okay. These people, and again, it's a good question, would probably be what we could call the Celtic people. These are people not necessarily only from Ireland. Celtic people were kind of obviously pre-Anglo-Saxon. They are found in Brittany, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the people in the Cornish areas, the Welsh areas, the people who still speak Gaelic in Ireland, Welsh is of a Celtic nature. So you're talking completely pre-Anglo-Saxon. You're talking about people, say, 4,500 B.C. This is before the pyramids were built. Some of these things were going up.
Is there any significance to the fact that this land mass, which is Great Britain now, is separated from the rest of the world and from the main European continent?
The significance, I would say, is that they have had a fairly isolated culture just because of being an island nation, and yet close enough to the continent to have some interchange. The greatest amount of megaliths is actually not in Great Britain, but in Brittany, in the northern part of France, but which is right across the channel from Cornwall, where the greatest concentration is in the English area. So I don't know of any specific reason why it would be different. It's interesting that some of the Greeks refer to the great stone temple built by the Hyperboreans. Hyper is the farthest and Borean is north, built in the far north. And it's interesting that the ancient Greeks even seem to know of what we might take today as being understood as Stonehenge. They had a highly rigorous mathematical mind. They had a highly intuitive sense of nature, and they put the two things together in a very unique way.
While these structures were being built, is there anything else in other parts of the world that corresponds? Is this an isolated event, or was this a global event?
It's a good question, because the megalithic tradition extends almost throughout the world. We find stone circles and megaliths in North Africa, in other parts of Africa. In the south, we find stone circles all throughout Europe. We find evidence of stone construction in areas of the South Pacific. We find them even in areas today on the West Bank in Israel, in ancient Palestine. This idea of using stone as a monument is a very, very ancient tradition, from the pyramids being a more sophisticated measure of it to the Easter Island statues. You find them. The American Indians have structures called medicine wheels. Again, they're stone circular shapes which encode sunrise and moon settings. The reason for this sun and moon preoccupation is that this oriented man, this was like their kind of collective digital watch, as it were. It oriented them in time so that they knew times for planting, times for harvest. It was their whole kind of calendar and orienting them to the entire season. And the solstice points, these are the points when the longest day would begin to go shorter, or the shortest day would begin to go longer. And these were the real critical points of the year for them.
Is there another significance other than the mathematical significance or the placing people in space and time based on the moon and the sun of the locations of the stone circles?
Yes, and this brings up a very interesting idea. This is what we today call the geopsychic hypothesis. Geo is earth, psyche is mind. We are working on a project which we call the Dragon Project. And in the context of this project, which I'll explain a little bit more in detail, is we're looking to see how the geophysical environment, that is to say the geology and the minerals and the underground water, can these factors actually influence consciousness? And the answer is a definite yes. For example, certain minerals emanate certain geophysical fields which can have profound impact on certain modes of consciousness, particularly where there are earthquake faults. You get quartz-bearing rock rubbing up against each other. You can get the emanation of what we call earth lights. They're almost like ball lightning. In a rock crusher, experiments have been done at the U.S. Bureau of Mines, taking granite cores that have quartz in them and crushing these things under, say, 30,000 pounds per square inch of pressure. And in the lab, balls of light will come out of this granite core. Now, this is a microcosm of what happens in an earthquake. In Japan, in earthquakes, massive luminous displays are recorded in the sky. Even in this neck of the woods, up in Santa Rosa, and some of the earlier kind of tremors and quakes, and in Alaska, definite luminous displays are seen. Now, you might say, okay, so what? The point is that these luminous displays have the ability to, and there are concurrent geophysical fields, to disrupt part of the normal brain function. There's a certain part of the brain we call the hippocampus. It's in the midbrain and the limbic system. And the hippocampus is that part of the brain which controls memory processing. It's your short-term memory processing. And if it's the least electrically stable part of the brain, so if these transient geophysical fields, because of these kind of tectonic stresses, arise, and you're around this and these kind of balls of light come out, your memory can start to go a bit crazy. It can spray onto the environment, almost things of a hallucinatory quality. And if you see one of these balls of light, the theory is that the mind can actually interact with them. And if it's an untrained mind, and you think, for example, one of your fears is demons or werewolves or monsters, you'll get that. It'll display as that, as if real, from the deepest recesses of your kind of reptilian brain. You'll get a spray of a mind projection onto this thing. However, if you're have some type of shamanistic training, some type of discipline, you can deliberately project on these things as though it were a TV matrix. The theory is, and I'm not saying this is absolute proof, but from talking to shamanistic people and doing research in it, the idea is that they could project on there, say, myths of the tribe or some teachings, and members of the tribe could see it just as though they were sitting in front of a video monitor. It's quite a far-out theory, and we're just working to develop it at this time.
Do these specific areas where the stone circles have been built regularly emanate this light form or this energy force, or do you have to wait around for 100 years until all of a sudden you get one big earthquake and you can see the ball of light?
Again, it's a good question. First of all, I should say that we've done a geological correlation in England, and we find that 90% of stone circles are built within a mile of a fault. So there's a very high correlation. The second thing is that these lights aren't bubbling out all the time from the stone circles. The shamans, the medicine men of early times, would have some type of understanding or indication when they would come and be able to kind of integrate the ritual with them. So they weren't coming out all the time, but these lights, as it were, they exist in Australia. They're called Min lights. They exist. The American Indians have records of them. South American Indians do. All types of traditions seem to have this in China, in the Andes. The interesting thing, for example, in modern times, for example, in the early part of the 20th century in Wales, there was a chapel called the Egrin Chapel, where when a very charismatic woman preacher would come in, these lights would come down and light right on the chapel, come right out of the earth, and everyone was getting real, kind of evangelistic over the whole thing. And no one could figure out why this was. Well, when we did a geological survey, we found that this Egrin Chapel was almost directly over the biggest fault in the area. So that there is some kind of correlation between these things, but the timing cannot be predicted, at least as far as we know yet.
If these things are so close, if the stone circles are so close to earthquake faults, have they been disrupted? Wouldn't the earthquakes themselves shake the stones out of place?
It's, again, a good observation, but the tectonic disturbance level in England is very minor compared to California or Japan or places like that. We're getting minor tremors. We're not getting major disruptive quakes, so it hasn't destroyed them. The main destruction of the circles has been from later population that wanted to just clear the land for farming and forgetting the old ways and considering these as purely pagan remnants, and that's where the majority of them were destroyed.
Is there a theory that these structures existed in Japan and in California where there is more seismic activity? And
I wouldn't say that you would have direct analogies in Japan to stone circles, but you do have definite shamanistic traditions in Japan, which I am sure would incorporate them. Other countries as well, we don't know the degree because we've just opened up this thing within the last 2 or 3 years. But I will say that a tremendous display of these lights is now seen in Norway. There's an area called Hessdalen where these lights are seen, so many of them, it is causing a real anomaly. They're seen like over the hilltops all the time.
why the dragon project? What is the significance of the dragon? Is that one of the images of a fire-breathing animal that...
Well, the Dragon Project, I actually named the project, and the dragon in early cultures, for example, in China and in Wales, were symbolic of the energy of the earth, a type of energy that we today really don't have a clue about, a natural energy which could be tapped by a kind of mind-earth interaction, a kind of living and a kind of ecological integration which we can't really consider today. However, the dragon was chosen because it symbolizes this. In later history, for example, when the church began to get powerful in England, you get legends of dragon slayers, such as St. George and St. Michael, which are kind of seen on the white knights with the lances putting down the dragon. This represented the church's attempt to put the old pagan ways, the old understanding of the earth, down in place of the new religion.
Maybe we've already answered it in terms of the interaction of the forces, the plates of rock underneath the surface, but different objects have been constructed on what some people refer to as sacred places or power spots on the earth. Is the earth at that spot more powerful, or does the constructed object somehow empower the earth at that point?
Again, it's an interesting question. It's like the chicken and egg type of thing. First of all, there is probably an initial site selection that is based on power in the earth. That is to say, the shamans are very sensitive to the geophysical energy fields. That is to say, any unusual mineral distribution will cause an attraction to a place on a kind of almost invisible level. We're talking about invisible energy fields. To give you an example, underground water, let's just start with water. Under certain underground water configurations, animals love to sit over. For example, cows in a field will sit over configurations known as blind springs. They're spiral configurations of water. If you were to drill there, you'd get a very rich source of water. Cows will stay over them. Sheep will stay over them. When you see gnats out in the country just circling over an area, they're over a water vein. Birds will light on them. If animals like dogs or cats could get out, domestic ones, they would like to give birth on such places. That's just the water. A specific mineral deposit, and one which is of quite controversial nature today, is uranium. Uranium, when left in the earth and not used for nuclear power, is considered by all Aborigines to be a tremendous source of natural power in the earth. What I mean by that is it influences vision, prophecy, fertility, unusual plants, and receptivity of a highly unusual nature. And that's why it's so interesting that today, in areas of great uranium deposits, for example, the Four Corners area, this is the most sacred part of the Hopi lands. Hopi are considered like the spiritual Indian custodians of the American Indians. The Sioux, the Black Hills, their most sacred place, all uranium mining going on. Australian Aborigines, their most sacred places, tremendous uranium deposits, and so on. So it's interesting that this mineral, when left in its natural form, gives a spiritual power, a spiritual integration, but when taken out, it gives an energy of a different type. But so these places, power places, are the underground water, certain mineral deposits, all have an effect on site selection.
What about the type of stones actually used in the stone circles? Is there a common element that runs through the various locations?
No, they're usually granitic or things like limestone. The most common factor in them, though, is the mineral quartz. Wherever quartz is found, you're probably familiar with all the crystal rage going on right these days. Wherever you find crystal, even in association with other minerals, it has some kind of resonating aspect with human consciousness. A molecular biologist pointed out that of all the inorganic substances on the earth, crystal has the closest analogy to a human cell. So crystal is, or quartz, let's just say, in these sites is really a key factor to integrating to human consciousness.
Is the Earth a living planet, or has it died?
No, well, definitely. All the Aboriginal traditions have pointed out that the Earth is a living organism. Mother Earth is always referred to as such. By living, they meant that it was something that nurtured them. It nurtured them in such a way that they didn't kind of gouge into it in huge kind of minds. They were very, if they took a life of even of an animals or trees, this was all considered to be something they gave thanks for at the time. And they lived in this type of harmonic relationship, which today is very interesting. There's new theories, for example, put forward called the Gaia hypothesis by an English scientist called Jim Lovelock, which he's an atmospheric chemist, which he says the Earth, again, is a living organism. From a scientific point of view, we find analogies to circulation, to memory, to a self-regulating organism, which really, from the biological point of view, the Earth is alive. The water being the blood, and et cetera, et cetera. It's not a direct one-to-one relationship, but for example, the Amazon rainforest, the last great stretch of virgin forest, is like the lungs of a continent. You can find a lot of different analogies. We shouldn't try to make it too simplistic that it's just a one-to-one analogy, but modern science, and there was this big conference this summer in Amherst, Massachusetts, all based on this living earth organism concept.
What about some of the folk legends which have surrounded the stone circles in an attempt to explain them? Are some of them on, and how far off have some of the stories gotten?
Most of the folk legends are kind of picturesque later renditions from the original time they were built. For example, many circles, for example, there's the circle where we're doing the Dragon Project, for example, called Rollright Stone Circle. The circle is also related to as the King's Men. There's a single standing stone across the road which is called the King's Stone. Legend has it that a witch told a chieftain that if he could take 7 strides and see a town called Long Compton, that he would be king over all of England. Well, he didn't quite make it. She threw up a magical hill, so he couldn't see it. And because of that, all of his men and he were turned to stone. There's a circle in Cornwall called the Merry Maidens, and 2 other stones in a adjoining field called the Pipers. And the Victorian legend is they were playing so lasciviously that they were turned to stone for this kind of getting out of hand. A lot of the folklore is kind of later, kind of Victorian overlays. But you also get folklore like at Rollright of the stones going down to drink at night from the streams and things like that. So there's a lot of folklore, but a lot of it seems to be later overlays.
What is the significance of these places now? Obviously, you've spent a good portion of time studying them. How do they affect you when you go to Stonehenge or any other stone circle?
When you go to a sacred site, first of all, it depends on how, shall we say, it is contaminated by the 20th century. You go to Stonehenge today, it's got barbed wire around it, it's got lots of tour buses, it's got refreshment centers, it's kind of like a little Disneyland. You destroy the immediate environment, the context, and you have destroyed some of the sanctity of the place. There's no question. You put asphalt over areas which were living and breathing, then they're dead. In fact, the Department of Environment has suggested that they build a replica of Stonehenge in plastic and set it out on the plain so the real thing won't get eroded anymore and people can just go and touch the plastic one all they want. So this is how far that people are getting from an understanding of some things. But the more remote ones, and as I say, in the British Isles there are 900 stone circles. That's just stone circles. There are standing stones, there are earthworks. England, probably square foot for square foot, is the most man-modified landscape in the world. Tremendous modification. And when you go to a remote stone circle that you have to walk a couple of miles or someplace to get to, you really get a feeling of entering into a different time space, of entering into a time when there was a certain kind of harmony, when there was a certain sense of cyclicity, these in time and nature. When you go out to a place like this, it makes you ask questions. It asks questions to you. What could this have been? What were earlier relationships to nature really about? How come that we don't find any writing or graphs at these places? We only find symbolic representations. We do find some kind of artwork in, for example, at Newgrange, but it's all kind of right-brained artwork. There's nothing kind of facts and figures. It's all kind of symbolic, almost kind of not really hieroglyphic, but in that direction. When you go to a sacred place, the thing that it does is it makes you remember who you are in the relationship of the total ecology of the planet. It asks you questions. How am I connected to this planet? How do I fit into this? What went on here? It makes you ask questions.
Are we connected by the mineral content in our body to these places? Is that a scientific explanation?
Well, we are connected in the curious way that we do have a very small minute of magnetite in the nasal area, which helps us to orient in time and space. For example, some people have an uncanny sense of direction. One of the reasons that they do is this little bit of magnetite. Birds have it. That's why they're incredible, and animals have it even more so. But one of the skills of ancient man was dowsing. Now, dowsing is the ability to find underground water, to find minerals, to find directions, to find animals, lost people, lost objects. That was like a sixth sense. A forked twig was used. Today we can use things as simple as a pair of coat hangers bent into two L-shaped rods. And they bypass all the rational ways of looking at the mind. And these sites were laid out by dowsing. It's like a direct sensing of the environment, which is non-intellectual, of energy fields.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.